Everybody. My name is Eliot Cohen. I'm the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to Measure Twice, Cut Once, assessing some U.S.-China technological relations. This is going to be both a panel discussion but also a very interactive kind of event. So from the outset, let me call your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have questions that you want to throw in for our panel, please begin using that soon. I'm quite sure that that's going to be filling up. Let me begin by introducing our participants. I'm going to start with our moderator, who is our very own Professor Hal Brands. Excuse me. Hal is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He has served in government as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and he's done a whole bunch of other things and written way more than I can imagine anyone else doing at a relatively young age. He's a very distinguished colleague of mine, and we're delighted to have him with us at SAIS. Our second guest is Richard Danzig. Richard is the former Secretary of the Navy. He's a senior advisor to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, a consultant to the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity. Again, many other distinguished memberships, boards, and what have you. He's a member of the Defense Policy Board, the Intelligence Advisory Board, and above all, a good friend, an extraordinarily creative thinker about all issues technological and many more besides. And finally, Christine Fox. Christine is the Assistant Director for Policy and Analysis at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Prior to joining the APL, she was the Acting Deputy Secretary of Defense from December 2013 to May 2014, which made her the highest ranking female official in history to serve in the Department of Defense. Before that, from 2009 to 2013, she served as the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, affectionately known as CAPE, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel that is experienced in government and also has fantastic credentials as deep thinkers about national security issues. This particular project is actually going to include a number of papers which will be dealing with the US-China technology relationship, which is arguably one of the most important facets of the Sino-American relationship. I think I can, without giving too much away, say that it's going to recognize both the advisability and necessity of some of those links, but also some of the intrinsic dangers. It'll be a discussion that I think is realistic about the nature of Sino-American strategic competition. That will be realistic about both risks and benefits. I want to just say one more thing before I hand things over to Professor Brands. One of the reasons why I'm so excited by this is I think this is one in what I believe will be and should be a series of collaborations between Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. We have an enormous amount to offer each other. We get along, which is no small thing, particularly in the academic world. And so I'm just really tremendously pleased that we're hosting this event. I want to thank Hal for helping to put it together, and our wonderful guests, Christine Fox and Richard Danzig, like I said, all close friends as well as colleagues. And with that, I'm going to drop off and hand things over to you, Hal.
Thank you, Eliot. I really appreciate you getting us started here and also making this event part of the Dean's Series, which has hosted a number of fascinating events with terrific speakers. And I think this one certainly meets the bill as well. You know, in addition to the stuff that Eliot said about the project and about the partnership between APL and SAIS, I'll just say that this issue, this question of how the United States should address the technological relationship with China could not be more timely. This is something that has been an increasingly pressing issue for a number of years, but one that is, I think, only superficially understood by many foreign affairs commentators. And I'm certain that it will be at or near the top of the agenda for the incoming administration. And so I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. I'm also pleased to see that we already have one question in the Q&A function. And so somebody's ahead of the game, and please feel free to enter questions at any time. So let me kind of kick us off here by asking Richard and then Christine to start at the beginning. And so the project is enormously ambitious. It includes a number of papers on various aspects of the US-China technological relationship. It tries to blend a strategic assessment of where the relationship ought to be going with a technical assessment of just the complexities of the technological relationship. And so, Richard, I wonder if you could get us started by saying something about how the project came about and how you conceived of the problem you're tackling. And then perhaps then we could go to Christine, and Christine, perhaps you could talk about APL's role in this and how it fits within the broader agenda there.
Well, I think how the project began from the observation that you just made, which is that there's a lot of relatively superficial discussion about technology, national security, and diplomacy and economy. It's very hard for any policymaker concerned with a large number of different things to begin to master the particulars associated, for example, with semiconductors or biology or artificial intelligence, all topics we commission papers on. I wouldn't exaggerate the extent to which any of us as panelists or others understand this. I think we improved our understanding. I think one of the challenges is there are always layers upon layers, and what you think you understand, you don't very well understand. But our thought was that if we could commission papers in selected areas like those I've mentioned by people whose expertise really was deep, we could instantiate the generalities and begin to develop enough insight to test some propositions and to see the variations in the terrain. So recognizing that, it seemed to me to be a good idea to commission papers by these experts and then to look at what the whole produced. And I did the usual thing that's done at the Applied Physics Lab when people have these ideas, which is I just handed the problem to Christine. So it's your turn, Christine.
Thank you, Richard. Richard was a very active leader of this project, so don't believe that. So APL is an organization that does a tremendous amount of research and development across government. But a large fraction of our research and development is focused on national security. So the idea and the importance of great power competition is clearly a factor for us. And so the opportunity to, through Richard's project, understand China's thinking in technology and how it affects national security, it was clearly a driver in our wanting to pursue the project. But there's much more to it than that. APL also does a lot of work in basic science and fundamental game-changing technologies. And in that world, we really need to have an international connection. We need to be plugged into what's going on all over the world in terms of the best new technology ideas. A lot of that is coming out of China. So it's important for us to understand what's going on there so that we can participate in that science development process. And then to make matters more complicated, APL is more recently getting engaged in important issues like national health. We have a new initiative on climate. What can APL, what can technology bring to these problems? And in those areas, there are tremendous opportunities and even compelling needs, as we see today, to cooperate with China. So Richard's vision for better understanding this complex relationship with China, between the US and China in the area of technology, was deeply relevant to APL and our efforts.
So let me dive into the substance. And so I was particularly struck by a key sentence from early in the introductory paper that Richard co-authored, which sets up the series. And so I'd be interested in reflections from you, Richard, and also Christine, anything you might like to add on this sentence. So what you write is the two countries' systems for research and development production, and sale of cutting-edge technologies have been substantially, though by no means uniformly, commingled. And so I wonder if you could set the stage for us a little bit by unpacking both pieces of that. How would you characterize the overall state of technological interdependence between the US and China? And then how does it vary across technologies or across particular parts of that relationship? Is it different when it comes to artificial intelligence than it is when it comes to semiconductors, for instance?
Yeah. So it is different. Let me just say first that I appreciated your noting that I co-authored that paper. My co-author, Loren Lasky, was also very involved in this project. And for much of it, we had Avril Haines as a co-director. Avril went on to leave the project to run the national security side of the Biden transition team. So I just underscore that because I'm sure there are errors and I would like to attribute them to those two people and not take any responsibility. But I'll take some responsibility. With respect to the point you raise, I think one of the major messages from the papers is this extraordinary diversity of the areas and of the combination or the conjoined status of China and the United States in that regard. If you take, for example, space, which we had a very able paper by Matt Daniels on, what's so striking is the two programs, China and the United States, really are separated. And the interesting questions are whether we have any regret about that, whether we'd like to see more cooperation, for example, mission to Mars or dealing with space debris, or whether we're just fine with that and what the consequences are. So that's one pole of distance. At another pole, you have areas like biology where there's almost no barrier for exchange or very little barriers for exchange between China and the United States. And in between, you have an area like semiconductors where there's extraordinary commingling. China is heavily dependent on the United States for upstream basic design kinds of capabilities and tools. And then downstream, the United States is heavily dependent on China for production and assembly. And the economies of the companies are intertwined. Just as a small example, in recent days, you've seen Qualcomm apply for and be granted permission to provide chips to Huawei. That suggests the magnitude of the commingling because in other dimensions, these companies are competitors and Qualcomm is a driver of US policy in some dimensions that's hostile to Huawei. So the bottom line is extraordinary degree of diversity. Most technology areas are somewhere in the middle, and I've suggested in space and biology two polar positions.
Christine, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you. So, I think that this diversity comes through when you read across all the papers. And I do think that it makes this such an enormously complex challenge because as Richard said when he started this study, most of the policy community is not deeply versed in technology. But as we think about the importance of technology policy going forward, and then you add into it the complexity and diversity that Richard just pointed out, I think you see that it gets even more difficult. And we really do need a very nuanced approach to this, one that is more tailored to the different opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. And that's quite a difficult challenge. I think the papers illuminate that, but I do think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to come up with that nuanced kind of approach.
Well, let me, go ahead, Richard, please.
I'm just going to add, in your own view, Hal, would be interesting about this. I think a fundamental problem is the difficulty of achieving nuance and knowledge. How do you, when more expertise is in the private sector than in the government, and the private sector actors have their understandable self-interests and are lobbying the government, the capability for introducing nuance, for using tools that are calibrated, is going to be very limited in government. And governments also move by large and typically somewhat rough-hewn steps. So one central problem is how do you get nuance?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I would say that it's not simply that a lot of the technological expertise resides in the private sector as opposed to government. It's that over the past 30 years, the U.S. government has actually reduced its ability to assess and understand technological issues with the closing of various institutions or offices that were devoted essentially to this. And so one of the things I think we learned from the Cold War, whether or not you like that comparison to the US-China relationship today, is that the shape of government and the network of relationships that government has to evolve to meet whatever geopolitical challenge the country is facing. The United States basically reworked its government to meet the demands of the Cold War. And so I think that as we start thinking about technologies in a more strategic sense, there's going to have to be a similar type of investment in terms of understanding the implications of advanced technologies today. And that actually brings me to a question that I wanted to put to you, which is that as the US-China relationship has deteriorated over the past few years, and I think that deterioration has been both obvious and marked, naturally questions of relative advantage start coming to the surface. And so for many years after the Cold War, I think the general assumption was that the United States and China could pursue a positive sum economic and technological relationship. Now you will often see it argued that that relationship has become increasingly, if not fully, zero sum. And so it raises the question of how do you think about questions of comparative advantage in the technological relationship? Is it useful to ask the question of who gets more out of technological interdependence on the whole, or is that the wrong way of framing it because the technological relationship is so variegated?
Christine, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Richard. So I'll take a crack at it. I do think that it is important to keep abreast of this comparative issue, but I don't think it is the only useful frame for this conversation. I think that technology is moving so rapidly, and as you've both already pointed out, so much of it is moving in the commercial sector. I think that the challenge is to understand how the technology advancements can benefit the international community and then separate out those aspects of it that are troubling to us from a national perspective, from a national security perspective. Now, just as nuance is not easy, what I just said is not easy, but I don't think that you want to look at everything as a race. In my own paper on artificial intelligence, where everybody's talking about the AI race, the argument is that is just the wrong paradigm for that. The race is not very meaningful. This is a foundational capability. As our director, Ralph Semmel, likes to say, it's math. How can you possibly compete over math, right? It's a foundational capability, and it has implications for the entire world. And so the challenge is to think about, where does it matter who's ahead? Why are they ahead? Why does it matter to us? But recognize that's, to me anyway, not a useful frame for everything.
And I'd add that your paper, Christine, I think nicely says it's not a race in the dimensions you just pointed out, but also it's a race in the sense that there's no finish line. At what point do we do our reckoning?
That's right.
I think the main cost from technology competition is in our ability to make scientific and technical progress. The two establishments help each other very much in that regard. For example, the ample presence of Chinese students in the biology labs in the United States, or the role of Beijing Genomics as a company in supporting activities in the US, and the intertwining of advancements in quantum physics between the US and China and the like. If you reckon up, though, in a narrow present tense way, the different technology areas, as a general rule, you're struck by, or I'm struck by, how the US is notably ahead in most areas, but that it's less ahead than it was 5 and 10 years ago, and that the presence of third parties in this equation is extraordinarily important. The Europeans, for example, and in some instances, non-European countries like Israel, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, are very important in that reckoning as well. And if you're committed to do a reckoning, you do a different one in each of the different areas, consistent with what we've been saying about differentiation and nuance.
So let me push a little bit of that. So Christine, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to tag on to this important point, I think, is that one of the things, as Richard said, we are mostly ahead in these areas, but that lead is closing. I mean, one of the things I do think we want to think a little about is we are ahead, but we are also very laissez-faire in the approach that we take as a nation to these technologies. And I think that when you look at the comparison that comes across all the papers, China is very deliberate in this. And the question might be for us is, do we need more deliberation in our own approach to make sure that we are working hard on ourselves?
So
You know
that,
I think that contrast is very legitimate. And the question you pose is the right one, Christine, about should we be more deliberate? I'd emphasize, though, that I think the differences between the two countries tend to be exaggerated. The Chinese have moved away from a state-owned enterprise-dominated model. And when you look at their technology advantages, many of them are advances occur through companies like Baidu and Alibaba and so forth. And the number of small startup companies, if you look at Kai-Fu Lee's book, for example, AI Superpowers, he's immersed in that small startup world. So behind the rhetoric of state capitalism, or if you will, underneath the superstructure, there is something that much more closely resembles the American system. And on the American side, I'm struck by how deeply embedded the ideology is that we don't direct these things through the state. But if you look at the major innovations in recent years, they're hugely responsive to support from the government, either in the form of grants or in the form of research, as for example, DARPA and the internet and GPS and the like, or in the form of the use of the DoD market, as for example, we nurtured the semiconductor industry. So the two systems are indeed quite different. And I think the way Christine posed the question is right, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate the differences.
So I want to push a little bit more on this question of advantage or disadvantage, because let's just stipulate for a second that you want to look at this from the perspective of American national security. And so there are certain areas where the degree of interdependence that you've described is clearly to America's benefit, even if you look at this from sort of a zero-sum nationalistic lens. The fact that we have over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States each year is a fantastic strategic advantage for the United States, even if there are some dangers associated with intellectual property theft in a very small number of cases. At the same time, there also seem to be some areas where interdependence may create strategic vulnerabilities. And so DoD issued a report back in 2018, essentially on the defense industrial base. And buried on about page 27 of the report was a sentence pointing out that most American munitions use components that are sourced from China. And that seems like it becomes a real problem on like day 3 of the war over Taiwan, or just, even if that doesn't happen. And so how should we think about those areas of the relationship where strategic vulnerabilities may emerge from the degree of interdependence that has developed?
Richard, do you want to go first on that?
Okay. Well, I think it's a big problem, but I think it's an almost inevitable problem in these contexts. You're right, the report was right to highlight the dependencies that exist within US military products on some Chinese technologies. Of course, the Chinese are even more dependent. So one might ask at square one, can you unscramble those eggs, and would it be beneficial to do so? I'm dubious about the ability to unscramble them, but I also think that actually those mutual presences may be stabilizing because they introduce a degree of uncertainty in both sides about what would actually happen if they came to compete. And that's a somewhat idiosyncratic or iconoclastic view within the national security world. But I think we need to think about both sides of this, both points in regard to this. First, just how bad is this and why? And second, how much could we actually do to undo it in a world of fundamental interdependence? Now, there are some very defined vulnerabilities and dependencies, and we begin to get to some of those in the national debate over Huawei that I think can usefully be addressed precisely because they're high level and definable. But as a general rule, I don't quickly climb on the bandwagon of building self-sufficiency. I would add that if you tried to build that self-sufficiency, it would be remarkably costly and costly both in dollars and in capabilities because you would be diverting so much energy to that. So that also makes me skeptical about the bandwagon.
So I will admit that the supply chain vulnerabilities cause me more sleepless nights, perhaps, than what Richard just described. I do worry about supply chain vulnerability. I do think it is a national security concern. Now, that said, I think Richard makes an important point about how difficult it is to unscramble the eggs and to sort this all out. But I do think that we need to pay more attention, and if we can't, and I agree it's too costly to be completely self-sufficient. That's the whole point of this work, is self-sufficiency is perhaps not the right goal, not the right lens. That doesn't mean you should be blind to your vulnerabilities in your supply chain. You shouldn't try to understand where those vulnerabilities might exist and understand what you can do about it. Now, big, hard problem, lots and lots of components in DoD weapon systems and in DoD platforms. But I do think that it's incumbent on our defense industrial base to be cognizant of the supply chain and what vulnerabilities they may be introducing.
Maybe it'd be useful if I take a concrete example, or do you want to go elsewhere, Hal?
No, please go ahead.
So let me take an example we don't talk about in the context of the APL studies, which is our power grid. Lots of observations about the population on that grid of foreign intrusions and abilities to potentially damage it. A lot of those are software vulnerabilities. No amount of hardware cleansing protects you against those, and we have a variety of protections against the software. I agree with Christine. I think the effort is worthwhile. You want to raise the level of deterrence by denial so that it isn't easy to complicate the situation or disable us. And you want to make it apparent that nobody really knows how effective that disabling activity might be. But I think the reality is you're never going to, in the modern world, be completely secure against it. And if that's true with respect to the software, it's even truer, I think, with respect to the hardware, where our ability to examine at the transistor level and so on is so extraordinarily limited. So for me, it's an illustrative example.
So let's actually talk about another illustrative example, which I think has gotten a lot of attention recently, and this is the issue of Huawei and 5G telecommunications. And so you write in your paper, Richard, that Huawei has essentially inverted the normal US-China technological relationship in the sense that we are now worrying about dependence on Chinese technology, where traditionally it had been the Chinese that worry about dependence on American technology. And so obviously Huawei has been the subject of a significant campaign by the present administration, which has lobbied allies and partners to avoid involving Huawei and the construction of their 5G networks. In your view, how severe is the strategic threat that Huawei poses to American economic or strategic interests? Does this administration have it about right, or is that challenge overblown?
I think the thrust of the administration's proposition is reasonable. I suggested earlier that there are some arenas that you can define and where the sensitivity is so great that it does warrant an effort at maintaining your system in a way that doesn't depend on foreign entities. I'm sorry, in this case, Chinese entities. I emphasize that is not self-sufficiency, because the key companies that we would depend on are European companies, Ericsson, or South Korean companies. So the practical reality is you're not actually achieving self-sufficiency, but are you advantaged by maintaining your systems in ways that are not dependent on Huawei? Yes. Is it worth the cost? In many contexts, or a number of contexts, it is worth the cost. And then you have to do a fairly calibrated judgment about where and how. I think my quarrel with the administration's policy is that I don't see a lot of broader strategic consideration. It's as though they picked up Huawei and then went from there to TikTok. And I don't feel as though there's a systematic consideration of the different technology areas and a choice according to a kind of serious cost-benefit assessment in each area.
Christine?
Thanks, Helen. So, you know, I think the Huawei issue is very important, and I agree with what Richard said. And I feel that the administration's concerns about Huawei are completely justified, but I also sense that the strategy of trying to push them back is got other perhaps downsides to it, such as the controlling the spigot, if you will, on the chips. So I think that it's much more a question in my mind of how did we get here? And what can we do to not be here in other areas in the future? I do think Huawei is an important example in the series of papers that kind of points out the risks of losing, because it is the area where we are behind now. And so what are we facing when you look at the potential of having, you know, Huawei stay dominant in the US, not be able to catch up in 5G or even advance in future telecommunications? Well, you face a world where we have separate and competing standards, where China's are not consistent with the values of the United States, but they're dominant because they have the dominant system, or a changing lack of interoperability, perhaps even a bifurcation of the internet ultimately. These are ends of sort of the globalized value chain that we've all become very accustomed to, and that I think does benefit all of us, and is why I at least would like to think of this issue more systematically than just decouple, because I think that combination is important. But we do need to pay attention to Huawei as sort of a case, and Paul Triolo in his paper it's just a wonderful paper that I learned so much from in teasing all this apart.
Well, Christine, let me stick with you for a second, because your answer touched on two bigger themes of the project that I'd love for you and then Richard to unpack a little bit. And when I was reading the introductory paper and then some of the other papers, it strikes me that there are kind of two big themes that stand out. Two of many big themes that stand out would be, one is that it is more important, as I think you put it, to run faster than to focus on slowing the Chinese down. And two, that the Cold War is a bad or misleading analogy for understanding the US-China technological relationship today. And so maybe I'd invite you to start and sort of expounding on those themes a little bit, and then we can get Richard's perspective as well.
Certainly. So I do really believe that, and it builds on other work that Richard was also a part of that APL published, we called A Preface to Strategy, that Richard led the writing of for our group of advisors. And the whole theme there is the United States has so many strengths. And in these technology areas, with the exception of 5G, those strengths have come together to put us in the lead. And so if you put your energy at trying to hold your competitors back, you're perhaps not putting resources where you have the lead and can continue to advance. And I think that focusing on our strengths and focusing on our strengths in technology has a lot of high payoff. And I see that every day at APL and in the whole tech world. In my Defense Department background, we have tremendous capabilities. But taking what Richard said earlier about the two systems aren't quite as different as I suggest, I do still see that we are more laissez-faire, perhaps maybe not than China, but then maybe than we should be, in terms of thinking about how to ensure that our technology advances to the best of our ability to keep us ahead. So I do think that's important. As to the analogy with the Cold War, that is absolutely a theme of Richard's paper, and I'd like Richard to take that one.
Well, first on the basic question about paying attention to ourselves, Christine and I think very much alike on this, and as Christine says, it's also reflected in some other work. I think there are two fundamental easy outs that we tend to take that I would love to see us resist. One is to blame other people for our problems, because the congenial attraction as a result is that we don't really have to do a lot to change ourselves. The second is more subtle and almost never discussed. I smuggled some of it into the paper that Miranda and I wrote. It is that we tend to confuse research and development and technology progress in that respect, which is very important, with the solution, with the view that if we lead in R&D, then we lead in power. And even in the narrow area of technology, from my standpoint, a critical issue is assimilation. And just as in the first problem, we cop out by saying, well, the problem is other people's, it's too easy for the national security establishment to say, well, I've dealt with the problems of, for example, artificial intelligence by funding research and development. Look at all the things I'm doing. Or I've established offices and gotten closer together with Silicon Valley. Well, those are very good things to do, but the fundamental question is your speed of assimilation. For me, the great example of technology absorption, the iconic example, is the Blitzkrieg. And here the Germans marshal new technologies, the radio, the airplane, the tank, and with its combustion engine. And the result is a radical transformation of their military capabilities and stunning victories in Europe. But these were commonly available inventions. The French had the combustion engine, the radio, and the airplane, and they produced from it the Maginot Line. So what we need to do is recognize that in the end, the competition with China is going to be one of assimilation. And I do think that in this regard, they are manifesting greater capabilities than we have shown, and that the two systems are different in this regard. I agree with Christine. I also think the two systems are different in what she's calling our propensity for laissez-faire. I just mean to suggest that the differences aren't as dramatic as they are thought to be. But the assimilation equation is huge. On the Cold War point, I would just note, we had a theory, the long telegram containment and the like, that what we should do and what we did then remarkably successfully is wall off the Soviet Union from the rest of the world. The reality is we can't do that with China. It's too integrated, it's too big, it's too global in its outlook. The Soviet Union was internally focused in its economy and otherwise. So there are other things that can be said about the difference, and I'd encourage people to read our paper. But I think that alone highlights a difference from the Cold War. I'm sorry, I've got to add one more, which is just, I believe that the Soviet Union, we all believe that the Soviet Union was dedicated to conflict with us and eradication of our way of existence. It's Khrushchev's "we will bury you." And I don't think that is the Chinese orientation or goal. I don't mean to understate the conflict between our democratic system and their totalitarian system, but I think in the immediately foreseeable future, they are very focused on their particular domain and do not have the same global agenda that the Soviet Union had. So the first point is one about capabilities, and I put the greatest weight on that. But the second point is about intentions, and I think it's worth noting.
Well, so Richard, maybe I could follow up on this. And so one of the things that you emphasize in the paper that you co-authored, and I think that which is also emphasized in many of the papers throughout the series, is the importance of the relationship between the US and China, which is indeed no doubt important. And you say that we should be working as best we can toward a shared cooperative future. But let me pose sort of a skeptic's question about this. What if the problem is that at root, the United States and China have fundamentally different visions of where the world is going and ought to be going? And what if the problem is that US and Chinese interests overlap and conflict pretty fundamentally in, say, the Western Pacific, but also with respect to visions of what type of governance and what type of political system should be respected and considered legitimate in the world? Is that, what sort of impact does a question like that have on the analysis in a project like this?
So I think you're entirely right to offer those skeptical observations. In my opinion, they are accurate. They're well-founded. there is fundamental conflict between an increasingly totalitarian regime in China and the US system. And when you look at what's happening with the Uyghurs and human rights and the Great Firewall with respect to the internet and this Chinese suppression of speech, there are very fundamental problems. And in my view, the US government needs to both object to those activities and be clear-eyed about their existence. But I do not think that that entails a complete abandonment of cooperation. One of the strengths of Chinese thought is the ability to accept contradictions and proceed with regard to them. And I think it is acceptable, indeed, I don't even in my Western frame of mind think it's contradictory, to join with China in things like efforts to minimize debris in space, which afflicts both of us, or to do grander things involving human spaceflight. I do think that we need to cooperate on things like climate change. Our performance in the pandemic is, from a human standpoint, way subpar in terms of the ability of our governments to work together. It's in our interest and their interest for them, for example, to rapidly supply knowledge that they've accumulated in January and December from their exposure to the virus in Wuhan, and for us to share our knowledge of vaccines and the like with them. So we have large areas of competition, and as your statement suggests, we need to be clear-eyed about that. And we need not only to be clear-eyed, but muscular in our objections and maintenance of activities like protection of Taiwan and sending ships through the South China Sea. And at the same time, we need to be cooperative and collaborative, because there are problems that are in fact capable of progress and indeed with cooperation, and indeed demand that cooperation for our betterment. So I believe you can't be so in love with the desire for cooperation that you slight the real abuses that China is involved in, and you can't, on the other hand, be so outraged at those abuses, which are outrageous, that you lose track of what you need to do to cooperate.
Christine, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Hal. So I guess I am a little bit more concerned about China's global aspirations in terms of influence. And as we did for you on the SAIS New World Order project that you led, did a piece that looked at kind of how China has been using actually COVID response and their health Silk Road to bring Huawei capabilities all over the world, and then through that to also get data and to advance their particular preference for system of governance, which is quite different than ours and not at all aligned with our values. So I'm actually concerned about the governance values competition part of this discussion. But like Richard, ironically, perhaps it takes me to the need for continued cooperation. And in my view, that cooperation leads us to conversations about these global values and norms of behavior and data protection and data standards, and in AI testing, and how you can know that a system, a capability, something you put in your home is safe. And what does this look like? That requires some level of cooperation, so we have transparency and insight into what each other are doing, and then a shared participation in these standard settings bodies, which we're frankly stepping back from more than China, and China is stepping up, and that worries me a great deal.
I would just add that I think that's right. It's not that the areas of cooperation are going to be pristine and suddenly the adversariness will disappear. They have to be monitored, and we have to be cautious with regard to them. But you earlier, Hal, referred to the 350,000 or so Chinese students in the United States and what an advantage that is. And we have two good papers in this series, one by Remco Svetsloot and the other by Rory Truex, on the students in the US and what all that is like. And that requires policing at the margins, because if we leave an open door, some various technology activities will become accessible to the Chinese that we'd rather not have accessible to them. But it's not as though this is some pristine thing on our side. We're trading the advantages that we gain for the disadvantages that we experience, and the advantages we gain in terms of insights, for example, to Chinese society, the sending back to China of people who have some sympathy and relationships with us, so on, are extremely important. So we're not going to be pristine in this relationship, and they're not going to be pristine in this relationship. But fortunately, being pristine is not a prerequisite.
So let me ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to Q&A from the audience, because we have a number of great questions in the queue, and I hope we'll get more. I want to talk about the idea that interdependence is stabilizing, and this is something you mentioned a few minutes ago, and it's prominent in the paper, and I have to admit that it makes sense intuitively to me, and yet I think there are perhaps a couple of things, a couple of challenges one might make to that proposition. And so Henry Farrell, a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, has argued that where competition is now happening is through basic weaponized interdependence, that countries are using their control of information, their control of key nodes in economic or information or technological networks to coerce their rivals. One of the arguments that John Gaddis made in describing why the Cold War turned out to be a long peace was that there were so few connections between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what drove me to this question is that you use in the paper the metaphor of a quarreling couple that nonetheless has to share a house. And I thought that was wonderfully evocative, but it raised a question for me. So if the quarrels become severe enough, living together isn't necessarily a guarantee of peace. It can be a spur to violence. And so I wonder if you might just say a little bit more about why you believe that interdependence is necessarily stabilizing rather than destabilizing, and perhaps sort of a vector for coercion or instability.
Yeah, I'm glad you focus on that. I'm glad to hear also that it intuitively, the point about shared interdependence may be stabilizing has some intuitive appeal for you, because I suspect it will be resisted strongly in other parts of the national security establishment. So to the extent we can get you out there in the front ranks arguing for it, I would favor that. I think I'm a big fan of the Henry Farrell work, and I love the Gaddis insight. I don't think that, again, these things are monotonic. There are areas of weakness that come from shared vulnerability, and there are areas of strength. The nuclear weapons circumstance suggests that in some regard. We're vulnerable to each other. There are aspects of that that are stabilizing, and there are aspects of that that are destabilizing. I think what we need to do is to explore this sort of area by area. We've already suggested in this conversation that for Huawei, a higher dependence on Huawei might well be unfortunate, and in my view would be destabilizing potentially. The shoe on the other foot, do we think it's destabilizing for the Chinese to depend to some degree on our equipment? I don't think we've really thought through the area. My own intuition is that it will turn out to be more useful, more stabilizing than we realize. But the core point comes back to the metaphor that you recall, Hal, in terms of the husband and wife or couple separating. It's as though we live in some small town and we have kids together. Yeah, we can break up and we can certainly fight, but if you can't leave the town, realistically, we better figure out, and we both care about the kids, in this case, the kids being the earth and climate change or the pandemic, then we clearly find it incumbent on ourselves, even while we quarrel and separate, to find ways to work together. And I think that's where we are with China. We just can't discard the relationship. So for me, a fundamental sort of overarching point, which Loren and I try to get to in the paper, is that it's very appropriate to do what we've done. And I thank Christine for the opportunity to look in detail at individual technology areas. But when you get done with that, you need to not only have a synthetic view of all the technology areas, but you also have to go up a step and realize that technology is important, but the most fundamental question is going to be the character of the relationship. And the technology is one important component in that, but just one component.
Christine?
So I don't have a lot to add because I think Richard said it so well. I would just simply comment that I do think that while the relationship is the thing and it governs the way we think about this technology, interdependence, and relationship, technology can play a role in the way we deal with technology in affecting that relationship. So if we take, for example, semiconductor chips, and the fact that we are turning that spigot to try to push things back for China and Huawei, and then you look at what that might mean for the future, we are taking steps right there that has big consequences for that relationship. So rather than being able to rely on us to be able to buy chips, they now are going to be incentivized to figure out how to build their own. It also sends a message to others. If you do business with the United States, you're subject to our dial. And then so it even has spillover in potentially other relationships around the world. So yes, I think the relationship is it. And we've got to figure that out. And where do we want to be in that relationship? But these activities that we are engaging in terms of this technology policy and technology relationship also has the reverse impact on the relationship that maybe we haven't thought all the way through.
So with that, why don't we start taking some questions from the audience? I'm looking at them in the Q&A bar, and there are some really excellent ones, and so I want to leave ample time for that. And Christine, I'll start with you, although I certainly welcome thoughts from Richard on this as well. In part, Christine, because you just, as you mentioned, wrote a paper on this for Johns Hopkins. And so the first question is a simple, potentially profound one from Nidal Zuhir, who basically asks, how will COVID affect the US-China technological relationship?
Well, it is a very, it's a very big question that I don't have a crystal ball for, but I do think that the way, not so much the fact of COVID, although there certainly are implications from that, but the way that the nations have responded to COVID, and as I mentioned earlier, the way that China has used COVID and COVID response in a way to expand their own influence and connections and export of their technologies globally is something that I think we need to take a lesson from. I think we need to pay attention to the fact that China dealt with COVID and then they saw it as an opportunity for them to advance their objectives globally, whether they're economic or exporting their system of governance. And we ought to be paying attention to that. And if we do pay attention to that, I think that it could absolutely affect at least our response. I don't know if it will affect our relationship. I think the relationship is something that we need to do a little bit more figuring out, as Richard has said. Richard, any thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly agree with what you just said. The thing that's so striking to me is Operation Warp Speed is in the US program for producing vaccines. It's housed in the Department of Defense, but its deputy and much of its staff is from the military ranks of DOD. But there was remarkably little consideration early on to the vaccine as a weapon of US, or an instrument of US diplomacy. For example, we've had a lot of reason to celebrate, and I join in it, the Pfizer and Moderna achievements announced now. And these were the first or two early arenas of interaction with Operation Warp Speed. But both rely on cold storage mechanisms that make them not particularly well adapted for distribution in the third world, as compared with, for example, the Janssen vaccine, which will come later. But those priorities and considerations really didn't factor into the US government thinking. There was no real plan for creation of production capabilities that enable us to export. The goal was have enough doses for 300 million Americans. So from the beginning, despite all the talk about soft power and the like, and the use of technology as an instrument of global influence, the US has come up short in that regard. And I'm a fan of many aspects of those programs. I encouraged them early on, but from the beginning, I've been a critic on these grounds. I have a short article coming out in December in the Improbably National Academy of Engineering on this issue. So maybe I can double my readership if even one person in the audience reads it.
Another question has come in that relates to this, and this is from Randy Lieberman, who asks about industrial policy. And so a more robust industrial policy is often offered as the solution either to the need to innovate more aggressively in technology in other areas, or to limit US vulnerabilities to interdependence on China. How do you think about the question of industrial policy and addressing a number of the issues that are raised in these papers? And Richard, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Christine.
Well, I'm very much in favor of the US government self-consciously seeding areas for research and development. And I emphasize that it's development as well as research. We've been a lot better historically at seeding the research. When we have market power in the government, I earlier referenced how we help develop the sophisticated aspects of the semiconductor industry. It's good to use that market power. I just, and I think one of the proposals for the Biden administration has been create a technology central figure in the National Security Council who can help prioritize these things. I think those are very good moves. I'd like to see us use the DARPA model in other areas, as for example, we talked about pandemics in the health arena. There are a lot of things to be done, but I would not be monotonic about it. Many of the developments that now we would prioritize, we weren't really thinking about as priority developments a decade ago or 20 years ago. Our ability to predict is very limited. If you go back and look at the predictions in 1990 about technology change in the beginning of the new century, 2001, they are striking for their underestimation of the internet. That is a really marginal thing in the minds of most of the people doing the predicting. And what's so striking about this is that it's there and we can't see it. And I don't think we're any smarter than those people. So I would try and avoid too deterministic an industrial policy.
Christine?
I agree about not being able to predict very well completely, but I do think that having a technology leader and technology leadership and technology policy from the White House is a good move. And I think that the trick is to figure out how to invest and where to invest. I couldn't agree more with Richard's point about that it's easier to invest in R&D than it is to invest in adoption. Yeah, we've got to figure that out. And there are ways that the government can invest to try to get over what we all call the valley of death, to take those innovations and that research and put it into applications. And that's going to take a concerted effort and some policy changes and some different approaches. I think the other area, and it's not really industrial policy, but I'm going to say it anyway, is education in STEM. I think we need, as a nation, to think hard about education and make sure that we are encouraging and finding all of the talented minds out there to help us with this technology age. I mean, it's going so fast. We've already outstripped the capacity. It needs an international approach. We've said that already, but I think the nation can invest more in education and STEM education, and I think that would go a long way.
I think it's terrific that you mentioned that, and I think we would probably both add immigration as well.
We've had a variety of questions come in about the possibility for technological cooperation between the United States and China. A couple folks asked about the possibility for cooperation in space or for perhaps talks on issues of limiting potentially dangerous strategic implications of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. When you guys look at where there might be possibilities for technological cooperation, what candidates stand out to you? Why don't we begin with Christine and then we'll go to Richard.
I think there are many. I think Richard already mentioned for space, debris management. I think as we put more and more and more satellites up there, we're going to need to come up with a way to share the picture of what's going on up there. I think there's ways to share in space science and science and space exploration. But, you know, there are many more. I think biology, Richard's mentioned, biology is a very ripe area. If we could collaborate on aspects of biology to actually take advantage of these breakthroughs and change not just the treatment of disease, but the status of health in the world, what a fabulous contribution. And I think if we cooperated, those kinds of things would be possible. So I think when we look at the kinds of implications technology has potentially for making the world a better place, for changing the quality of life of people, we should seek those opportunities. And in so doing, I think we also have a better opportunity to talk together about what could possibly go wrong, right? I mean, Richard talked about the internet, how we didn't envision its importance. We also didn't envision cyber as a warfare area then. And so if we talk together, we might have that opportunity to also think about how technology might go awry and what we might do in terms of, again, global norms and standards and so forth to try to keep it on the right path. So I think there's lots of opportunities.
I think that's a terrific answer. I'm particularly sensitive to the technology risk areas. I published a paper 18 months ago called Technology Roulette, in which I tried to emphasize the risks associated with biological experiments, with our nuclear activities, in arenas associated with cyber viruses and the like. So I think that there's a potential for cooperation in diminishing those risks, analogous to the efforts we made as we distributed our PALs and other systems to reduce nuclear risks around the world amongst other holders of nuclear weapons. I think there are a lot of arenas, and we need to give this substantial emphasis, but I won't go on at any length because I think Christine said it well.
So over the summer, many of the kids on my block were seized with the potential of a ban on TikTok, which would disrupt their lives in profound ways. And so a question comes in from Zach Wheeler, who's a student at SAIS, who asks, in your opinions, is TikTok a legitimate threat to US national security? And if so, why? Richard, would you like to take first crack at that?
Well, I'd like to talk with the kids on your block. I think that anything can be a threat to national security if weaponized. Read Henry Farrell's piece. Some things are more subject to that than others. It's a right perception that TikTok can provide all kinds of data and insight about American activities that may be exploitable and hostilities. My problem is that there are so many other things of which that's true that focusing on this one is a little bit like plucking one student out of a class and grilling them and ignoring the others. It isn't so. I'm trying to find a metaphor that may appeal to this audience, Hal. I think that I don't feel that there is a strategic logic behind the movements against TikTok.
I don't have a lot to add to that, Hal. I think that, frankly, we ought to be thinking more broadly of TikTok and all of the other organizations that collect a lot of data on individuals about privacy, data norms, standards, et cetera, across all of these organizations and companies. Some companies are further ahead in that than others. It certainly is an issue that we need to be thinking about, but I think it's a broader issue.
So there have been a variety of questions that have come in about the prospects for U.S. policy under the incoming administration. And so maybe I can synthesize them a little bit and simply ask, if there were one or two major policy initiatives that could be taken in the technological arena that you would hope to see a new administration take, what would they be? And so why don't we start with Christine on this one, and then we'll go to Richard.
Wow, it's a terrific question, and there are so many opportunities. I think the first one that comes to my mind is we need a a better relationship between government and commercial technology as we think about how to best advance technology appropriately in the nation, but also globally. So those conversations have started. There's a lot of initiatives in like DoD I'm most familiar with of engaging. But I think that something that brings all of the technologists together and encourages them to consider themselves as a part of the government, not in terms of being controlled by, but participating to the well-being of the nation, I think that would be a positive thing. And I think a technology focus coming out of the White House that is inclusive and engaging of the broader sphere. And of course, I would include organizations like APL and the R&D community at large. I think that would be a very valuable thing. And then, as I said earlier, I truly believe education is the other one where we really need to focus on education in helping us maintain our tech edge.
Richard?
Well, first I want to express my deep gratitude to you, Hal, for asking Christine to go first. Because you earlier rightly expressed the skepticism, the dark side of the US-Chinese relationship, Hal, and because I take that very seriously, one very high priority for me would be to drive the Pentagon more intensely and fiercely to adopting the new technologies, absorbing them and adapting to them. I gave the Blitzkrieg example earlier. I don't feel that the US military, comfortable with its successes to date, and unfortunately paying the price of its professional skills, which are developed in traditional weapon systems, has nearly the urgency that it needs to have in absorbing the new technologies. So that would be a first priority for me. Second, I would very much second Christine's observations about STEM education, but I would add, as I did earlier in our dialogue, the emphasis on immigration, because you can immediately change that scene, whereas the STEM is a long haul build. I completely agree with Christine. I want to invest for the long haul, but I also want this urgent attention to making the US more accessible and welcoming again. And I think it's fundamental to a fourth thing that you've written about, Hal, and that Christine touches on, which is the building an alliance of democracies in this arena. Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell have a good paper on this. The president-elect has himself written about it. I think we need to recognize that one of the differences from the Cold War is that it's not such a dominant US world. In the wake of World War II, we have 50% of global GDP. Now we have 25%. Our ability to actually create the kind of world we want in terms of technological developments, attention to our values like privacy and speech, and our ability to compete with China in these realms is so intertwined with other nations that we have to internationalize this effort in fundamental ways. So those are a handful of things that for me would be very important priorities.
Hal,
Yes.
could I chime in? Richard has brought this up a couple of times, and I just wanted to kind of foot stomp this notion that it's more than just R&D. It is about adoption. And in adoption, I would like to add that I think the next team of leadership, particularly in the Defense Department, needs to push for new operational concepts, because what can happen if we don't do that, I think this is what Richard is pushing on, is it would be a shame if we took and suddenly did everything we currently do with military forces, but we added some of them in as unmanned, but nothing else changed. It's just not taking advantage of the technology and the promise of the technology. We really need to think hard about new uses of it, as the Blitzkrieg example. So I just wanted to foot stop Richard's point. And that's going to take a bit of a push. We're really going to have to step back and think hard about these new concepts.
Go ahead, Richard.
I was only going to say that if it is a function of DoD in part to prepare for a third world war, in order to deter it. What position are we in analogous to the beginning of World War II? And I think we're a lot closer to France than we are to Germany.
Well, that is a sobering note. Let me pitch one more question to you. And this one actually comes from a colleague at APL. And so, Christine, I will start with you once again before going to Richard. And the question is, how can we better integrate the technology and policy communities to create governance structures that are appropriately agile given the rapid pace of technology advancement?
Well, my APL colleague asks a very difficult question, and I think my hat's off to that excellent question. So I don't think there is a magic organization. I don't think we need a new task force. I just don't think that's going to work. But I absolutely mean what I said earlier, and I think that there's the root of this question, which is we need to engage the technology community, and I include APL in that for sure, in thinking about these technology policy questions. If you accept the premise that Richard offered earlier, and I absolutely agree with, that the policy community is going to struggle to keep up with technology. It's moving so fast already. It's across so many fronts. It's not reasonable to expect the policy community to be deep in all of these technologies. So they need help. They need help from the technologists themselves. And so that there needs to be outreach to the technologists. The technology community also needs to step up. They need to recognize that they have a role to play here and to think about some of the implications of their technologies and the policies that might go around it. Who better to help set standards and norms than people that understand the technology deeply? But that's not their traditional role. So I think we need more conversation to change this view of these roles, and the technologists need to be a part of that. Now, that's not an organization, a person, a solution in that regard. But I do think it's going to take outreach from the White House to these communities to try to get their head in the policy game.
Richard, what would you like to add?
I would just first go back to Christine's earlier point about STEM education. One of the advantages that China has at the moment is that to a striking degree, its leadership is engineering educated, and its leadership is comfortable with scientific propositions, and ours, to a striking degree, is not. And that's a problem. And Christine's long-term STEM education program will help with that. In the near term, we have to be aware of that and move to compensate for it by integrating advice and the like. Part of the challenge is for technologists. They need to be able to speak in non-technological terms about policy implications of technology and the like. We tried to answer this question in part, though, by acting and not just speculating, by commissioning these papers. The question was, could we get technologists to speak about these issues and produce outcomes that were readable or at least assimilatable through intermediaries by policymakers? And I think we had some success and we have some limitations. But one of the educative things for me about the project was how difficult it can be to get some people who are technologically astute to think in not just analytic and descriptive terms, but also prescriptive terms. Okay, I understand this. What does it mean operationally? What should a policymaker do? Those are hard questions for technology people, precisely because they're so fastidious about what the evidence is.
I think that's a really appropriate note on which to end this conversation. And I know we could go for hours more on this, but I'm conscious of time. And so I just want to say thank you to Richard and Christine for sharing your thoughts with us here. I want to thank the audience for coming out and spending some time with us this afternoon. And because we had a couple of questions about if the papers are indeed publicly available, the answer is yes, and you can find them on the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab website. And the title of the series is Measure Twice, Cut Once, Assessing Some US-China Technology Connections. You should download and read all the papers because I predict that they will elicit a very intense and constructive debate about one of the most important issues in national and international security today. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to Richard and Christine. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope to see everyone again soon.
And thank you, Hal, and thanks to SAIS for hosting this. We really appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation.
And I just want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have any further questions, particularly difficult ones, to put them to Christine.
I was going to say to Richard, Richard's the lead. Thank you, Richard,
Thank you.
for leading this study.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Take care.